Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Midweek Bible Study, and we're going to get back into 1 Samuel, and we're going to look at about 3 chapters here, 21, 22, and 23. But before I do that, I was just thinking about this. I know last week I was encouraging you, but I did it at the end of the video, and if you're like me, sometimes you don't watch to the very end of the video. But what I had asked you to do was give it some likes, or you can give it some dislikes, but I also encourage you to create some dialogue, to ask some questions, to leave some comments, to say, hey, my commentary says this and it was very helpful, or or my study Bible had this note in it and I really like that, or that's my favorite verse, or I completely don't understand it. You can comment so many things, and it can create a Bible study where we interact a little bit more instead of me being your talking head, which I know sometimes might not be the best scenario for us. But I was here, boy, I hope maybe we can do this. Right here. If you're on the phone, and many of you are, you pull it up and it looks like this. So like here is this week's worship service that we had for, it's on Ansonia. And so if you haven't already, if you haven't subscribed to the Ansonia page, you'll have a big red subscribe right there, which you'll see I've already subscribed, and it says I'm subscribed. I don't have my notifications on because I know when the videos come out, and so I know to look. But if you want it to ding you when the videos come out, you just press on that and it sends you there, and you're like, what do I do? Okay, here's what you do. See where it says notifications? I hit the little bell that had the cross through it, and it sent me right here. I would hit that notifications, and then you just click allow notifications. Again, I don't do that because I know when they come out, so I don't need another thing dinging me. But if you want that, it reminds you. So, and I ask you to leave comments. If you leave comments, here's the way to do it. If you're looking at it like this, you're like, if you don't just know, it's going to look like this. If you don't just know to do that, you don't know exactly where to go. Well, you can press this button here and see where it says comments. You can add a public comment that everyone can see. We can say awesome service. That was for this past Sunday, which it was an incredible service. And so there you go. So then we could dialogue back and forth about that. And you can do that, of course, with the Midweek Bible Study. See, that'll come up. It'll come out Wednesday evening, 6 o'clock. And you can make your own comments if you're interested in doing that. I want to encourage you to do that because it encourages me, and I do think it will create a bit of a dialogue with us. With all that said, I'll quit talking about technology and talk a little bit about 1 Samuel now. 1 Samuel, what we're going to look at, we're going into a section where David has had his last conversation with Jonathan in chapter 20, and he's like, I got to get out of here. Jonathan said, yeah, you better get out of here. Dad is serious. He wants to kill you. And so they made a pact with one another, a covenant with one another, and David left. And these chapters is about David on the run. He's fleeing, and it's back and forth between David fleeing from Saul, and then it goes back over to Saul in his pursuit, relentless pursuit of David. And it comes clear, in these chapters that it's some of David's darkest hours, where I think he probably doubts himself and maybe his calling and his anointing a bit. But so we're gonna learn this. Keep these three things in mind as we walk through just a couple of these verses here. There are times that people will come against us, oppose us, and try to keep us from reaching the goals that God, and the dreams, the ambitions that God has given us. Another thing is, keep this in mind, God's calendar and our calendars are not always the same. Sometimes we have a much different, we want things much more speedily sometimes than what we feel like God is answering or fulfilling something. But hang in there. What's that in this? And also that we need to understand that spiritual maturity, growth, emotional maturity, these things, a character, deep character, those things develop over time. And so with all that in mind, let's go in, and I'm going to read a few verses in chapter 21, starting in verse 1. It says, David went to the town of Nob to see Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech trembled when he saw him. Why are you alone, he asked. Why is no one with you? And David answers him, the king sent me on a private matter. He told me not to tell anyone why I'm here. I have told my men to meet me later. Where to meet me later. Now, what is there to eat? Give me 5 loaves of bread or anything else you have. So, like I said in the previous chapter, David and meets with Jonathan and they part ways. And because that's the safest thing for David at that moment in time. And it was the formal separation of David and the family of Saul. He's no longer, won't serve anymore on Saul's court. He's not a general for Saul's army anymore. And we see now that David has fled to the land, or the city of Nob. That's in northern Israel. And it was known as the city of the priests. And so he's met there by the priest, Ahimelech. It says that Ahimelech was shaken when he first met David, and he was, maybe it's because that Saul hadn't always treated the priest very well, and maybe he thought David was coming to do something that was not good. See, they didn't have the smartphones. They didn't know that David had separated from Saul. This is the first place David went, and that news had not traveled, and so he wasn't aware. So he just assumed he was Saul's representative. But one thing we pick up on at another place, it shows that Ahimelech and his family were some remains, if you will, of Eli's family. And God had said that Eli's family would no longer serve in that role as a priest before God because of their unfaithfulness. And that was in chapter 2 when God says this to Eli. 1 Samuel 2, let me just read you 2 verses. It says, Therefore the Lord, the God of Israel, says, but because of their unfaithfulness, and particularly because of Eli's son's unfaithfulness, God says, I promised that your branch of the tribe of Levi would always be my priest, but I will not honor those who but I will honor those who honor me, and I will despise those who think lightly of me. The time is coming when I will put an end to your family, so it will no longer serve as my priest. All the members of your family will die before their time. None will reach old age. And not here in this account, not at the hand of David, but in the next chapter, at the hand of Saul's command, he finds out that Ahimelech has aided David, and he wouldn't listen to any reason, and he had him and his family killed. Uh, and that's over in the next chapter. So we're not going to read all that, but I encourage you to read through 21 and 22. And of course 23, we'll look at a bit of it. But anyway, what David was there for, back to the story, he was there for some food. And he was a little unsure of how to respond to, because he didn't know what Ahimelech knew about Saul's wanting to kill him and all this stuff. And so he didn't, he wasn't very forthright at all. He said he was on an assignment for the king. Well, he wasn't. But what he goes and does, he asks for food. And so that's what, well, it's just, I'll read on. Verse 4. Ahimelech responds to David's request for food. He says in verse 4, we don't have any regular bread. But there is the holy bread, which you can have if your young men haven't slept with any women recently. David says, don't worry, I never allow my men to be with women or when we're on a campaign, and since they stay clean even on ordinary trips, how much more on this one? Since there was no other food available, the priest gave him the holy bread, the bread of the presence that was placed before the Lord in the tabernacle. I had just been replaced that day. That had just excuse me, it had just been replaced that day with fresh bread. So there were, what this is concerning the bread that is in the Holy of Holies on the altar table, and it's called the bread of the presence, or the showbread, and there's 12 loaves, 2 rows of 6 on it. And they represent the 12 tribes of Israel, and it's in the most holy place before God, and it sits there before God, and it's put on there with fresh bread every Sabbath, and only the priests are allowed to eat it. Yeah, it's won't go into it, but actually Jesus mentions this to the religious leaders who was giving him a hard time about doing stuff on the Sabbath, and he refers to Ahimelech giving David this showbread to eat, and in a rebuke to them. But you can look that up on your own. Let me go on in verse 7. Verse 7 says, Now Doeg the Edomite, Saul's chief herdsman, was there that day. So he had showed up while David had come to Ahimelech, and it says that he had been detained by the Lord. So David asked Ahimelech, Do you have a spear or a sword? The king's business was so urgent that I didn't even have time to grab a weapon. I only have the sword of Goliath the Philistine, who you killed in the valley, the priest replied. It's wrapped in a cloth, and if you want it, take it, for there's nothing else here. There's nothing like it, David replied. Give it to me. So this guy, it just one little brief sentence there that says, oh, this guy Doeg was there. He's an Edomite. An Edomite is supposedly the descendants of Esau. Remember Jacob and Esau, and Jacob was later named by God Israel, which was the like the father to the 12 tribes. And so it's their uncle Esau, so to speak, and so a descendant of his, Doeg the Edomite, was there, just happened to be there. He was like the chief shepherd for Saul. They had somewhat good relations with the Edomites, and that's good. But so again, Ahimelech doesn't expect anything, a foul play from David. So he's like, here, take the sword. Goliath's sword, and David took it as a great gift. That's just first exchange you see after, as David takes off, fleeing for his life. And he feels it necessary not to be completely truthful with the priest. And it's just a sad state of where things had gone to. Let me read some more real quickly here. I'm going to go over in chapters 23. In between, we have David fleeing to another place, and fleeing to another place, and Saul's pursuit of him. And he continues on the run, and he's on the run through these things. And we'll talk about in a second about some of the people he meets along the way that's a blessing to him. But nevertheless, he is running for his life, and he acts like a crazy man, literally, in some of these scenes that we read. And I think he's just scared and unsure, but he's clinging on to his faith through it all, and we see that God helps him through. Samuel 23, verse 15. One day, near Horesh, David received the news that Saul was on his way to Ziph to search for him and to kill him. Jonathan, who had come with Saul, went on ahead to find David and encourage him to stay strong in his faith in God. "Don't be afraid," Jonathan reassured him. "My father will never find you. You're going to be king of Israel, and I will be next to you, as my father Saul is well aware." So the two of them renewed their solemn pact before the Lord. Then Jonathan returned home while David stayed at Horesh. David's still on the run, still hiding in Horesh. Horesh literally means the forest, and it gives us a description of the rugged terrain that he was having to stay in. And so that's what's going on there. Jonathan, though, shows up. He continues to reaffirm, to assure David of his allegiance to him, and assures him that God is with him and protecting him, and is going to bring him to the place to reign as the next king. So verse 19 in chapter 23. But now the men of Ziph went to Saul, and it said that who Saul was in Gibeah, and betrayed David to him. "We know where David's hiding," they said. "He's in the strongholds of Horesh, on the hill of Hachilah, which is in the southern part of the country. Come down whenever you're ready, O king, and we will catch him and hand him over to you." "The Lord bless you," Saul said. "At last someone is concerned about me. Go and check again to be sure where he's staying, for I know he's very crafty. Discover his hiding places and come back when you're sure. Then I'll go with you, and if he's in that area at all, I'll track him down, even if I have to search every hiding place in Judah." So the men of Ziph returned home ahead of Saul. Meanwhile, David and his men moved on in the wilderness to Maon, south, in the south. When David heard, verse 25, when David heard that Saul and his men were searching for him, he went even further into the wilderness to the great rock, and he remained in the wilderness, but Saul kept after him. Verse 26, Saul and David were now on opposite sides of the same mountain, and it says that as Saul and his men began to come in close to David, all of a sudden there's an urgent message that the Philistines were raiding Israel again. So Saul quit chasing David. He'd almost gotten him. He quit chasing, but he had to quit chasing David, and he had to return and to fight the Philistines. And it says, ever since that time, the place where David was camped has been called the Rock of Escape. Verse 29, then David went on to live in the strongholds of En-gedi. Here we see, we find out, first of all, that Doeg, the Edomite, had given up David. And now he'd given up David at when Saul got to Nob, and Doeg told on David that he was there, and he told on the priest, and the priests were killed. And there was only one priest that escaped that. It says there was like 85 of the family of the priest were killed that day. And but Saul. But now these inhabitants of Ziph said, we're ready to give David up too. So, getting good with the king, right? And so we'll even capture him for you, they say. But Saul was wise enough. He knew how crafty David was, elusive and resourceful. And so he said, you go lay your eyes on him, and then I'll come. Because David was clever, but David was blessed by God as well. And I think we know that Saul knew that. And so David, through God's help and his own craftiness, he stayed one step ahead of Saul. And it got to this point where he is almost captured, and then the Philistines became the distraction. And so I believe that was a godsend, literally. And but back to those lessons. We see these things, we read these things in these 3 chapters, and we just have to acknowledge that there are times that though we've been anointed and called by God, people will come against us. Rest assured, Jesus said, you will encounter troubles. But take heart, I've overcome the world. In this world we will have troubles. But God had selected David. And you got to rest in that. When your circumstances don't show that you're moving towards that great ambition or that great calling that God has for you, you got to understand that if it's a God-given, it's a worthwhile thing that we need to resolve to know that God is with us and to move forward. And you know what? God was working continuously in David's circumstances. He was working to bring about the good. Remember Romans 8:28, that God works for the good of those who are called who love Him, called according to His purpose in all situations. And if God is for us, it says in verse 31 in Romans 8, if God is for us, who can be against us? During that time, David brought in the one priest that escaped from Nod, Abiathar, and he helped him, and Abiathar helped David likewise. And later he helped him secure the kingship after Saul had killed himself. That's a little later. David, during this time, he met 400 men that he began to lead, and that were mighty warriors around him. And he was building his own leadership. God had given him the camaraderie of all these relationships. His relationship during this time was reaffirmed with his great friend Jonathan, who kept pointing him to the faithfulness of God. He was helped by the king of Moab, which was not a small thing that the king of Moab would help him in these chapters. All of these things were preparing David for his next step in life. So even though there are times that people will oppose us, God is with us as His children. He's with us. Number 2, it takes time. We live in a culture, we're conditioned not to really embrace God's timing. We live in a time of smartphones where we have all the information that we need, or that we think we need right in front of us. We have more information than we can even process. And we eat fast food. We make our food in microwaves. We want things and we want them right now. But sometimes God is about the long view, bringing things into place in His perfect timing. And quite frankly, David was anointed the king, but he wasn't ready to be king. And that's the third thing. He was building David's spiritual maturity. He was building David's character during this time. He was developing his emotional capacity to stay resolved and stay on. It's just a process. All this is a process, and God was faithfully bringing this about. It says in a commentary I enjoy about this particular time in David's life. It says many times, Dr. Kevin Mellish says, many times in life, the most positive and long-lasting changes that take place occur after we have endured a period of arduous testing or unpleasant, even painful experiences. God builds character in us during trying times. Our test, God wants to bring our test into testimonies of His goodness and faithfulness, and us making it through dark times. Dealing with adversity pushes the Christian, the Christ follower, hopefully you, that's who I'm talking to, pushes you towards Christ, to hold on and to cling on. And that's really the best place we can ever be, to be all that God has called us to be. And so if you have any thoughts on that, any comments on that, I want you to be encouraged by that word, by these passages. They're very meaningful to us as Christians. And I hope you'll read through 1 Samuel 21 through 23. And in fact, I hope in the upcoming week, between now and next study, that you'll read the next couple chapters as well. So God bless you. Have a great day. Be blessed. Love you guys, and I hope to worship with you this Sunday.